I've been working the night shift at the local nursing home for nearly a year now. It's a job I never imagined myself in, but I needed the money. The nights are quiet, sometimes too quiet. The residents mostly sleep through the night, and the building feels like it's holding its breath. But there's one patient, Mr. John, who's always stood out. Mr. John had been in the nursing home for as long as I could remember. He wasn't a difficult patient, grumpy but harmless. He'd spend most of his days staring out the window, talking about the old days and sharing odd stories. Most of the time, it was just rambling. But once in a while, he would say things that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. He'd tell me stories about people he saw walking around the nursing home, people who weren't really alive, or they're hiding from something. At first, I laughed it off, thinking it was the ramblings of an old man, but there was something about his eyes when he said it. They weren't full of fear, they were cold, like he knew something I didn't. That night, I was doing my usual rounds when I noticed Mr. John's door was slightly open. I hadn't been in his room since my last check an hour ago, so this was strange. Normally, he liked his door open a crack, but tonight, it was wide enough to see inside. I called out his name softly, Mr. John, but there was no answer. I stepped in, and the room felt off. The air was heavier, like the pressure had shifted. And then I saw it. The bed was empty. I immediately went to check the bathroom, calling his name again, but there was no sign of him. Panicking now, I rushed to the nurse's station, asking if anyone had seen him. They all shook their heads. No, he hasn't been out of his room all night. My heart was pounding in my chest as I went back to his room. I called out again, Mr. John? No response, but then I heard it, a rustling sound from the corner of the room. I froze. The corner was dim, but I saw a shape sitting there, slumped against the wall. It was Mr. John, but something wasn't right. His body was stiff, like he had been frozen in place. His eyes were wide open, staring straight ahead, but his face was expressionless. His lips didn't move when I called his name. I took a cautious step toward him. Mr. John, are you all right? He didn't respond. His body didn't twitch or shift in the slightest. But then, just as I reached out to touch his shoulder, his head jerked toward me, his eyes still wide, almost unnaturally so. I took a step back, startled. My pulse raced, and I opened my mouth to speak, but his lips parted first. You shouldn't have come in, he whispered, his voice strained, like it hadn't been used in a long time. They know you're here. I couldn't understand what he meant. I was terrified, but I couldn't leave him like that. Mr. John, are you okay? You need help. Before I could finish my sentence, his body slumped forward, as if the life had drained out of him. His head fell forward with a sickening thud, and he was motionless again. I bolted out of the room, running to get help. But when the doctors and nurses arrived, they found the room empty. The bed was neatly made. The staff insisted that I must have been imagining it, but I knew what I saw. The worst part. The next night, I went back to check on his room. The door was open, and when I stepped inside, his chair was there, facing the corner, empty, and I could swear I heard his whisper again. They're still watching. I worked the night shift at a small 24-hour convenience store. It's in a rough part of town, the kind of neighborhood where people don't always follow the rules, but it's a job. It's the quiet nights that make the shift eerie. Just the sound of the buzzing lights, the faint beeping of the register, and the occasional customer who stumbles in for a pack of cigarettes or a late-night snack. But that night was different. The store wasn't busy. It never was at 3 a.m. The aisles were quiet, and the hum of the refrigerators and the occasional beep from the register were the only sounds breaking the silence. But there was a feeling, an unsettling feeling, that something wasn't right. It had started a few nights ago, this constant sense that I was being watched. I'd glance around, but there was never anyone there. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the isolation of working alone at night. Around 3 a.m., I was restocking some shelves when I noticed a man standing near the back of the store by the coolers. He wasn't looking at the products though. He was just standing there, staring at nothing, his back to the aisle. I felt a chill run down my spine. "Can I help you find anything?" I asked, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet store. The man didn't respond. He didn't even acknowledge that I was there. I tried again. "Sir, are you all right?" He finally turned around slowly. His face was pale, sickly even, his skin almost translucent. His eyes were wide, unblinking. There was something wrong with the way he looked at me. It wasn't just cold, it was vacant, empty. "You shouldn't be here," he muttered, his voice raspy, like he hadn't spoken in years. I took a step back, my heart hammering in my chest. "Excuse me?" The man didn't say anything more. Instead, he turned his gaze back to the coolers, as if I wasn't there at all. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. The air felt thicker, colder. The man didn't move. I tried to speak again, but the words stuck in my throat. I took a deep breath and turned to grab the phone to call my manager, but when I looked back, he was gone. The shelves were still stocked. The lights were still flickering. But the man, he was gone. No sign of him, no movement, nothing. I searched the entire store, even outside, but there was no trace of him. I'll never forget the way his eyes seemed to follow me, even when he wasn't there anymore. The worst part? The next night, the feeling of being watched came back. And every time I turn down that same aisle, I swear I see something moving in the shadows. Something waiting. It was my first night working at the office building downtown. The company had just moved into this older, run-down building, but the pay was good, and the hours weren't bad. I didn't mind working late, especially when the building was mostly empty. It gave me time to focus on the tasks I had to finish. But that night, something happened that I'll never forget. The building was old, and the elevator was even older. The walls were made of chipped metal, and the floor was lined with worn carpet. Every time it moved, you could hear the clunky sounds of the machinery inside, like it was struggling to keep up. That night, I had a ton of paperwork to finish, and I'd already been working for a few hours longer than expected. By the time I finished, it was almost 1:30 a.m. The office was completely quiet, the only sound coming from the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. I had been using the elevator every night to go up and down the building, and it was always empty at this. When the doors opened, I was surprised to see another person inside. A man in a suit, standing in the corner with his back to me. I didn't think much of it at first. It wasn't unusual to see someone else working late. I stepped in and pressed the button for the parking garage, but the man didn't turn around. He didn't even acknowledge my presence. I found that odd, but shrugged it off. The elevator descended, and suddenly, it stopped. The lights flickered, and the usual buzzing sound of the elevator's motor slowed down to a faint hum. It wasn't just stopping on a floor. It was stuck. I pressed the emergency button, but nothing happened. My chest tightened with anxiety. The man didn't move. He just stood there, staring straight ahead, like he didn't even hear me. I called out to him, "Are you okay? Something's wrong with the elevator." But he didn't respond. I moved closer, and that's when I saw it. His face. His skin was pale, almost grey, and his eyes. They were hollow. The skin around his eyes was stretched thin, as though he hadn't blinked in ages. I froze in shock. "Are you okay?" I whispered, trying to back away. The elevator jolted suddenly, and we began descending again, much faster than usual. The man didn't flinch. I was too terrified to even look at the controls. And when I glanced over at him, his face was still as lifeless as before. And then, something changed. The elevator didn't stop at the garage level. It just kept going down, deeper into the building, far beyond the floors I knew. I started to panic, pressing all the buttons, but nothing worked. The elevator came to a screeching halt and the doors opened. I was met with a completely unfamiliar floor. The walls were cracked and the air smelled musty. The lights flickered dimly. When I turned back to look at the man, he was gone. I ran out of the elevator, heart pounding. But when I checked my phone, I saw the time. It was still 1:30 a.m. There was no way I could have spent that much time in the elevator. It felt like hours had passed. I didn't take the elevator again after that night. But every time I walk past that part of the building, I swear I can hear the faint sound of the elevator, moving even when it's not in use.